Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 9th chapter in Luke's Gospel. We're going to cover the tail end, verses 46 all the way on home, verse 62. But in order to, before we show the focal point, we have to establish the frame of the portrait we intend to deliver, and we're going to retrace just what happens in this chapter from its beginning. In the first 9 verses, the 12, the apostles, the disciples are commissioned with his authority, and they go out and perform all these great signs and wonders as he has promised through the power of his name. And the word reaches Herod, the district ruler, and he's confused because there's a confusion about who he is. Some say Elijah and some say John the Baptist, but John the Baptist, he knew he had already beheaded, so he was perplexed by how he could be resurrected, and so he was seeking to see him. Then the 10th, there's 5 events which occur before the material we're going to cover, the first of which is the 12th of the commissioning, the second of which is the feeding of the 5,000 from 5 loaves of bread. He feeds 5,000 in a city called Bethsaida, and he distributes them accordingly, and he feeds the crowd that had gathered and accumulated around him. So he was attracting audiences of some 5,000 people. This guy had a mega church before there was even such a thing. So he was a popular man amongst a lot of people. But verses 18 through 27 is the third section. This is the Peter's confession, the correct confession of the identity of the Messiah. He first asks, "Who do the crowd say I am?" And they reflect much of the same confusion that we've earlier read from Herod. Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and say one of the old prophets has risen up. So the theme of Elijah is actually prominent because we actually meet him in resurrected form in the Transfiguration, the event which expires. But after affirming the correctness of his revelation, he turns it personal, and Peter, being the spokesman of the apostles, answers the question correctly. He says, "Thou art the living son of the living Elohim." And in Matthew's account, he tells them that flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, and upon this confession you are my rock. Upon this confession my church will be built. And I think it's the confession more than Peter himself. The Catholics disagree, but we don't have time to get into that. Then he outlays some of the demands of discipleship. Frankly, predicts his death for the first of 2 times. He's going to suffer much, be rejected by his own, and then killed and raised the 3rd day. And then he lays out the lines of demands of discipleship, which consist of self-denial, cross-carrying, and then we can follow him. And we have to put our priorities, in order. What is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses his himself destroyed or lost, or his soul in other translations. So that's just something we have to calculate. Count the cost, he says in Luke 14:28, before you sign up, and he doesn't leave any ambiguity as to the terms or the demands that discipleship demands. And he's much the same thing that he instructs the 12 to do. If the home accepts them, to bless them. If they reject them, shake off your sandals and pronounce it accursed. Then is the Transfiguration. 8 days after these words, he's in. It's only him and Peter, John, and Jacob, and what I want to suggest is that the exclusivity of their vision, while the other 9 were struggling to cast out a demon, in the 5th event, which occurs before the material we're going to cover, was launched the sort of egotistical, self-exaltation question that they ask. We'll get to that when we get to that. But Elijah and Moses are there, and Peter once more speaks out loud. And then the voice from the cloud comes and says, "This is my son, the beloved, hear him," much the same thing that he pronounced at his baptism. Luke documents his description in the 3rd chapter. And then they make it their way down from the mountain on the next day. So 9 days after Peter's confession, the three of them break down, and there's a lapse or a chink in their team. The chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and it's discovered that the remaining 9 are the weak links in their chain. So this man says, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son, for he is my only child." And see, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out, and it convulses him with foaming, and scarcely leaves him, bruising him. So this only child of his only son, is completely demonically dominated. He has no will or control to call his own. He is a drooling vegetable with no modicum of self-control, and it's actually inflicting injury on him, so possessed is he. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they were unable. So how does Yahshua respond to this? And Yahshua answering said, "O generation, unbelieving and corrupted, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." So he's talking about the disciples. They are part of the unbelieving, the same wicked and adulterous generation that seeketh after a sign that he indicts in the context of the promise of the sign of Jonah in the 11th chapter. So he summons the son to him, and then, he instantly heals him. He performs an instant, total, and thorough exorcism. There is no demon that he cannot cast out. The demons tremble at his presence and at his name. And the crowd is amazed at the greatness of Elohim. And while they were marveling at all that Yahshua did, he said this to his disciples. So this is something that he didn't tell the crowd. He said it to the disciples while the crowd was adulating loudly around him. "Lay it up in your ears, these words, for the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this saying, and it was veiled from them, so that they did not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. So their error of assessment, not understanding the significance of this saying, it went in one ear and out the other. The terms sound shocking to us, but for whatever reason, there was some spirit that was veiling it from them, and they couldn't intuit it, they couldn't understand it, and they were afraid. So fear was the electric fence of having their worst fears confirmed, because he had already predicted this this isn't the first time, nor will it be the last time that he predicts his death. So he is marching en route to Jerusalem in the chronological context to his death. And 46th verse, 9th chapter, Luke, lesson itself. "And a reasoning rose among them, who might be the greater of them." So a reasoning is a dispute or a debate amongst them and between themselves as to and the nature of this debate is which among them is the greatest of all. They aspired for preeminence of position, yet they forgot the humility and self-denial that had just been proclaimed 10 days earlier. We don't have a time frame when this reasoning rose among them, but one of the demands of discipleship is deny yourself, forsake your own individual identity, attach yourself to him. He becomes your identity, so you cease to exist as you once and traditionally knew itself. The problem is that the natural man and the indwelling sin nature still resided in these apostles at this point. "And Yahshua, having seen the reasoning of their heart, took a little child and placed him by his side." So there's no indication that he heard this. He had instant spiritual intuition. He could read the beatings of one's heart and the thoughts of one's mind just like that. So that he saw the reasoning of their hearts. He has supernatural beyond superficial insight. He pierces and tries the hearts and the spirits. And, as an example, he answers their question with a physical example, a demonstration of proof in the form of a child, an ordinary, obscure, average child, and just places him by his side to pinpoint them who is the greatest in the kingdom, with an implicit rebuke that it's not you, it's this little simpleton, sweet simpleton next to me. "And he said to them, whoever receives this little child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you all, he shall be great." So how we treat the lowliest of his servants and his creatures in creation is an accurate reflection of how we treat him, and how we treat him is an accurate reflection of how we treat the Father. And the principle of the first being last and the least being greatest, this ties into the other paradox of humbling oneself to be exalted that we read of in 14:11 and 18:14, the latter of which in the context of the parable of the prayer of the publican and the Pharisee. But, it's a reversal of order. Pride can do us only injury and can only do us harm. Pride precipitated the fall of Lucifer, and we can follow him to his destiny of doom if we let that spirit dominate us or control us or overwhelm us. So being close to the namesake of our religion is no automatic guarantee that you are going to be saved. Just look at what happened to Judas. And John answering said, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he did not follow with us. So the John is the beloved apostle, the one who was there at the Transfiguration, one of the ones the author of a gospel and 3 epistles in the book of Revelation, affectionately self-referenced as the beloved disciple. But here we read before he became the apostle of love, he and his brother were the sons of thunder. That's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. But elsewhere we read that he who is not with me is against me. And, we'll get to that. But Yahshua said to them, do not forbid him, for he who is not against us is for us. So if you see another hindering the, advancing the spreading of the kingdom, do not hinder it. And what does he elsewhere say? That he who is not with me is against me, and who he is not gathering scatters. And the contradiction is only apparent between he who is not against us is for us and he who is not with me. First off, he translates the tension of the pronoun from us and we to you, so he personalizes it. And but they both indicate and communicate with clear, concise, unmistakable language that neutrality is just another one of Satan's lies. There's no such thing once we come to an awareness of who he is, and do not hinder those who are gathering, because if you do that, you're scattering, you're going against me. So we want to hold both sides of the equation as we understand our undivided and uncompromised love, loyalty, devotion, affection, and adoration for the one we serve. We cannot let anything or anyone get in between us and him, and there are literally thousands of distractions which can compromise the purity of our motivation for following him. And it came to be, when the days of his taking up were completed, even he turned his face to go to Jerusalem. So this alludes to a day ahead, and it came to pass when the days of taking up his cross, is one of the ways he was taking up, were being completed. And he was looking back at Jerusalem. This is he's en route there, and he hailed from Galilee, which is to the north of Samaria, which was the region of the north of Galilee was to the north of Samaria, which was to the north of Judea. They would have been trekking and en route to Judea, the region in which Jerusalem dwelled. And most ordinary Jews would have went around, self-respecting Jews would have went around the Jordan and wouldn't have passed through and contaminated themselves with the presence of the unclean one who's claimed to be sons of Abraham. They refused and denied. But, he breaks the barriers in John's 4th chapter. We witness him placing the seed that would sprout into the evangelical harvest that would eventually be reaped by Philip. He's the one who converted. In Luke's gospel, it's in Luke's book of Acts, rather, it's the 8th chapter. But Luke has a clear effect. The only time that Samaritans are even mentioned in Matthew or Mark are in reference to the disciples' commission, where he commands them not to set foot in the villages of the Samaritan. But in the 6th verse it reads, go through the villages, bringing the good news and healing everywhere. So there's no limitation on or imposition on where they can and cannot go. And Samaritans, as a Gentile, Luke had an affection for the Samaritans that the Master had, that he especially emphasized in the chiefly in the Good Samaritan parable, where he proved that Samaritans, though despised as heathens and outcast by Jews, were perfectly capable of excelling them in good works, and also the grateful leopard, the one who responded with an expression of thanks, gratitude, and praise for being liberated from the disease of leprosy. 9 of the Jews didn't return to thank him. They just walked off in faith. They got themselves examined. It was only the Samaritan who even thought to return to thank the one who had liberated him from the equivalent of a living death. There's nothing pleasant about leprosy. And he sent his messengers ahead of him, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. So he sends messengers. It's just plural. That could mean any number. We don't want to engage in idle speculation, but the purpose for which they were sent was to prepare for him. So they had to pave the path and lead the way and proclaim that the king was coming, though he was not received as such. And they did not receive him because his face was turned for the journey to Jerusalem. So they are unable to overcome their native bitter animosity towards him as a Jew, because they know he's en route and destination to Jerusalem. The Samaritans had their own temple of worship that they didn't go to the one in Jerusalem. And they knew that he was there, and they wanted nothing to do with him, even though he wanted everything to do with them. And the advice that John and his brother, James, who is also there at the Transfiguration, offer is testament to the earlier alluded to nickname, the Sons of Thunder. And his disciples, James and John, seeing it, said, "Master, do you want us to command fire to come down from the heavens and destroy them, as also Elijah did?" So for the 4th time in this chapter, we read the name of Elijah, and these men were clearly influenced, having been privy to the revelation of the Transfiguration, being familiar with Scriptures. 2 King, the 1st chapter, the power of rain was invested in Elijah in the 17th chapter of the 1st book of Kings, and in the opening verse of the 2nd book, opening chapter, read that the fire is at his command. And the end times witnesses, the 2 of whom we read of in Revelation 11, are modeled on the actions and deeds of Moses and Elijah, and one of the things they were able to do is command fire to consume all who oppose them, all who hinder them, all who obstruct them. They have the commandment of fire. They have fire at their disposal, and also rain, so they can make the crops to grow by their rain. And so the point is that they are responding rashly and in judgment. They did not see the potential for repentance. Just because he was rejected there initially does not mean he would be embraced, and the conversion of Samaria was a milestone in the fulfillment of the Great Commission. Of Luke's version we read of in Acts 1:8. But having turned, he rebuked them and said, "You do not know of what spirit you are, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went on to another village. So full steam ahead, he's just talking to them while they're leaving. He's turning while he's walking to them just to rebuke them and chide them and say, you're not of my spirit, which is divine, so that means you are of a demonic spirit. The spirit of bloodlust and vengeance is demonic in origin, so they are of a demonic spirit. And they have a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the purpose and the mission of the one they called Master, who came not to destroy, but to save lives. So in John 3:17, you read that he came not to judge, but to save. So he could have judged them right then and there for initially rejecting him, but he knew that within their hearts the seed was planted, and it does take approximately 7 times for anyone to hear the good news before they can be converted. So don't give up if you've only told your friend who's on the fence about it, once or twice. And it came to be as they journeyed on the way that someone said to him, "Master, I shall follow you wherever you go." So this man, once he is told the demands of discipleship, there's an ephemeral enthusiasm that people who have not counted the cost come to the one they call Jesus, and that's just because they think they like there's a multitude of reasons. They think it'll make their life better, more pleasant, if they will be rewarded for their righteousness, but that's not all the case. He demands nothing but the very top from us, because he wants nothing but the very best from us. So his enthusiasm is ephemeral as his response to the answer. And Yahshua said to him, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the heavens nest, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." So this itinerant wandering preacher was homeless. He was at the mercy of the charity and hospitality of guests wherever he went, and he had no trouble making friends, and he had friends all over the place, but he did not have a home to call his own. And the life of the disciple, one who followed him, they forsook their fish nets, Matthew forsook his toll booth, they dropped everything and ran to them, and they did not have property or possessions, but they had the greatest possession in all of human history, the intimate presence and accessibility of the presence of the most remarkable man who ever lived, who was a man and yet more than a man. And he said to another, "Follow me," but he said, "Master, let me first go and bury my father." So he does not have the priorities which we mentioned earlier. These priorities are not intact. His eyes are on the earth. He wants to bury his father. His father had not been dead. He wants to wait till his father's gone before he can follow him. So he had is in Luke 14:26, and he says, "Anyone who does not hate their mother and father and family, compared to the love they bear me, is unworthy to follow me." So we have to be willing to forsake, if necessary, family, jobs, careers, everything else in order to embrace the calling. Whatever it is, whatever it takes, it's just something you got to do. And these demands are these were given to individuals. They are not universal, but these were men who encountered the literal flesh and presence of the one we call Yahshua. And Yahshua said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and announce the kingdom of Elohim." So the spiritually dead can lay and bury the physical dead. They can wait until they die, and the whole world is a graveyard of sin. And people who are lost spiritually, dead spiritually, there's no activity, no motion, no inertia. It's just a spiritual graveyard out there, and we who are spiritually alive should be proclaiming the news in the spiritual graveyard, bringing light where there is darkness, so that the spiritually dead can embrace the light, run with it, and live through it, and have a new possibility, a new reality, a new existence, an eternal potential, just everything that he can offer if we aren't so mindful about the thing that our earthly responsibilities. We got to put it in perspective and have proper balance on it. And another also said, "Master, I shall follow you, but let me first say goodbye to those in my house." So he's ready to follow him. All he wants is just to retreat from his presence now and go back to his house. But the master, as he says it, this disqualifies him. You have to be go where I go, say where I say, do what I do, do what I want you to do, be who I want you to be. And the family will still be there when he gets back. And Yahshua said to him, "No one, having put his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of Elohim." So if you embrace this walk, if you walk down the straight and narrow and then you turn to the side or you turn back, then you are not fit. You are disqualified. You will not gain entrance or access to the kingdom of Elohim if you not do finish the race which you embark on. If you have ephemeral enthusiasm, it's not that saves you. It is enduring to the end. And anyone who looks back, just remember what happened to Lot's wife, as the Messiah references in the 17th chapter of Luke. He exemplifies Lot's wife, who looked back at the smoldering ruin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And why? Because she was longing for her sin, and those cities were epicenters of iniquity. So she wanted to have one last look at it, and that's what killed her. That's what turned her into the pillar of salt. So it is dangerous to forsake him once we are enlisted into his services. So I hope you're here to stick with it. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.